Welcome to the Vault of Lost Tales podcast.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a look into the world of the Irish author J. Sheridan Le Fanu. We'll be exploring his life, a bit about his death, and really focusing on one specific short story, The White Cat of Drumgunniol.
Yeah, and the idea is to see how an author's life, their times, kind of seep into their fiction.
Yeah.
And how one story can, ripple outwards.
Exactly. So what are we working with source-wise?
Well, we've got quite a mix. There's info on the Catsif from Celtic myth, an analysis of Le Fanu's psychological ghost stories, which is really interesting.
Okay.
Then some threads on Irish folklore, a paper comparing the Banshee and the Ruzaka, a blog post on Le Fanu's fairy tales specifically.
And the story itself, I assume?
Oh, yeah. The full text of the White Cat, plus summaries of his other work, some background on figures like the puka, and even an article on cat symbolism. So quite a bit to draw from.
Great. So let's start with the man himself. J. Sheridan Le Fanu. He's writing in Victorian Ireland.
Right. A time when literary realism was, well, on the rise, but people were also deeply fascinated by spiritualism, ghost stories, that sort of thing.
And what seems to set Le Fanu apart, according to some of this material, is that he wasn't just doing, anonymous spooky encounters. He went deeper.
Exactly. That analysis of his psychological ghost stories really points this out. It suggests his ghosts weren't just external threats. They were often sort of conjured from the character's own minds.
Like anxiety's taking form?
Pretty much. Exploring inner turmoil, guilt especially. That seems to be a big theme.
Yeah, I saw mentions of that in relation to other stories like The Haunted Baronet and Mr. Justice Harbottle, where guilt literally haunts the characters.
Vengeful spirits as like manifestations of bad conscience.
And thinking about his context, born in Ireland, lived through what some sources call oppressive conditions. Do we see connections there? Did that environment maybe shape his focus on anxiety and social rules in his ghost stories?
It's definitely plausible. I mean, living under difficult societal constraints, that kind of atmosphere, it can easily fuel stories about internal anxieties and breaking rules, right? It gives the supernatural a sort of psychological grounding.
Makes sense.
And it's interesting that later in his life, apparently towards the end, he wrote 4 stories specifically set in the fairy realm.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they were supposedly quite successful. Shows he was really engaging with that Irish folklore tradition throughout his career.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to The White Cat of Drumgunniol, published 1870, so just a few years before he died in 73.
Right.
And the setup is, it's framed as a story told by the schoolmaster, Dan Donovan, looking back on his childhood.
Yeah, reflecting on his youth in this really rural, kind of isolated spot in Ireland, somewhere between Limerick and Dublin near Keeper Mountain. The setting seems key.
It really does. The description of the old farmhouse, Drumgunniol, it has an orchard, this old roofless tower, like a defense tower from old raids.
Adds to the history, the weight of the place.
And a liss nearby. What's a liss exactly?
It's basically a fairy fort or mound in Irish folklore, a place you wouldn't want to disturb. Believed to be inhabited by the good people, the fairies.
Right. So that landscape, the loneliness, the history, the folklore baked right in. You can see how it would breed superstition, especially for someone described as having a dreamy mind like Donovan.
Absolutely. It perfectly sets the stage.
Okay, so the plot kicks off when Donovan's father sees this large white cat with green eyes.
Yeah, coming home from a fair.
Yeah.
And bam, instantly thinks it's a bad omen.
And that encounter, it sort of unlocks this family history, this whole legacy tied to a white cat omen. Tell us about the ancestor, Connor Donovan. He seems pretty central.
Oh, definitely. Connor's story is the origin of the curse, essentially. He was wealthy, but also known for being cruel, wasteful.
And the crucial part.
He wronged a woman named Ellen Coleman, promised marriage, then ditched her to marry someone else for money. A real act of betrayal.
And that's the trigger.
Seems to be. Because after that, Connor starts being haunted by a figure it's implied to be Ellen Coleman's spirit, who actually strikes him.
Wow.
Physically. Apparently so. It leads to his health failing, and then this really strange death.
And the cat.
The cat appears at his wake. A white cat, right there on his corpse, terrifying everyone. That's when it becomes the established death omen for the Donovans, directly linked to Connor's cruelty.
So from then on, seeing the white cat means death or serious illness is coming for someone in the family.
Exactly. It precedes the deaths of Donovan's father, his uncle. It's this recurring family doom.
And even Donovan himself, the narrator, remembers seeing some kind of mysterious female figure as a child near a loft. So it connects his own experience to this broader supernatural stuff.
It weaves it all together.
So thinking about Le Fanu, rating this in 1870s Ireland, what specific folklore might he have been drawing on for this white cat imagery?
Well, that blog post about his fairy stories explicitly mentions a cursed white cat rubbing up against its victims and links it to the Banshee legend.
Ah, the female spirit wailing before a death.
Exactly. And other sources mention that in some Irish families, a white cat was seen as a death omen. So he's tapping into existing beliefs.
Interesting. What about the cat sif? That came up in the sources too.
Yeah, the cat sif. Now, that's typically described as a large black cat with a white spot, more Scottish Highlands.
Okay, so not a perfect match.
Not identical, no. But the core idea is there a supernatural cat, potentially a witch in disguise. There are beliefs about leaving milk out for it at Samhain for good luck, or it causing trouble if angered.
And the idea of witches turning into cats seems widespread.
Oh, definitely. With that whole 9 lives thing, sometimes meaning 9 transformations, after which they're stuck as a cat. So the general folklore around cats and the supernatural is very rich.
There was also that mention of the late wake, the Fail Fidela.
Right, guarding the body before burial to stop creatures like the cat sith from stealing the soul. Using music and distractions, it shows how real that fear was.
You can really see Le Fanu drawing from this whole, cultural soup of beliefs.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
especially given his Irish roots.
And what about the female figure, the one haunting Connor and the one Donovan maybe saw?
Well, that comparison between the Irish banshee and the Slavic rusalka is fascinating. Both are often female figures with long hair, a comb associated with water sometimes, and foretelling death or danger.
So that recurring motif of the female death messenger.
Exactly. It strengthens the idea that maybe the figure haunting Connor and the later white cat omen are connected, perhaps both stemming back to the Rondel and Coleman.
Okay, so if we think about Le Fanu's broader work, his focus on guilt, how does the white cat fit in or maybe influence things? Does this theme of a family curse from a past wrong show up elsewhere?
Oh, for sure. The whole premise of Connor's cruelty causing generations of suffering in the white cat fits perfectly with themes in, say, The Haunted Baronet or Mr. Justice Harbottle. That idea that your past sins will find you, often in a supernatural way. It seems to be a core Le Fanu concern.
Right, the past isn't really past.
Not in his stories, no.
And the cat itself, symbolically. That article on cat symbolism must have some insights.
Yeah, it's incredibly rich. Cats are tied to femininity, both the positive, like intuition, and the darker side, sorcery. They represent independence, mystery.
And death omens, connections to the underworld and some folklore.
Exactly. Think of Egyptian Bast, Greek Artemis cats have been both worshipped and feared. So using a white cat specifically, as this death omen taps into all these deep cultural layers, adds resonance.
It's not just a random animal.
Definitely not.
And it was mentioned that Le Fanu's fairy stories, this one included, were later used or referenced by others, like Walter Evans Wentz.
Yeah, which suggests they made an impact beyond just his readership at the time. They fed into later folklore studies or collections.
And maybe influenced later fiction, too. Someone mentioned folk horror.
It seems plausible. The stories focus on a specific family, a specific place, this recurring local supernatural threat tied to the past. You can see the seeds of folk horror there, where the landscape and history itself hold the dread.
Okay, so pulling it all together. Le Fanu's Irish background seems crucial. The folklore about banshees, death omens, supernatural cats like the cat Sith, curses linked to past wrongs. It all feels present in the white cat.
Absolutely. He's weaving these existing threads into his own narrative.
And the story reflects his recurring themes like guilt manifesting supernaturally, but also potentially points forward, maybe influencing that folk horror genre down the line.
Yeah, it really sits at an interesting intersection of folklore, psychological horror, and maybe even early folk horror elements.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much an author's own life, their cultural background, the beliefs floating around them, how much of that gets embedded, sometimes subtly, into the stories they tell.
Creates layers you might miss on a first read.
Definitely. It makes you want to dig into more of Le Fanu and maybe explore that Irish folklore a bit more, too.
For sure. There's a lot there.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.